tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
I want to turn from the regulation of the internet to education. It's been a recurring theme for so many people in this country, frustrations with what their kids are learning in the classroom. But these issues go beyond just curriculum concerns. It's also about the caliber and quality of education, and a lot of that comes down to the caliber and quality of teachers. But Caylan Ford has done her part in Alberta to push back against a lot of the problems in the education system, founding the Alberta Classical Academy. And she also had a great piece in The Hub. Universities have a monopoly on teacher training. They don't deserve to keep it. This was an argument I hadn't really entertained before, actually a conversation I had with you not that long ago, Caylan, because I had always just sort of accepted the status quo as being necessary, that, you know, a teacher's college at a university is the way you train and certify teachers. But there's a better way, you say. Tell me about
it. Sure. Well, I guess to give a little bit of background here, in Canada, this is different in some other international jurisdictions, but in Canada, you basically need a Bachelor of Education or a B.Ed if you want to teach in a classroom and be certified by a teacher's college. You can also do a post-degree B.Ed. So after you've already obtained a bachelor's degree, you could then go back and do what is in most provinces a 2-year post-degree Bachelor of Education. And I think that the reason why this has been implemented is precisely for the reason that you alluded to. We think people, teaching is an incredibly important vocation. It's one of the most important jobs for sort of perpetuating and preserving your civilization is the education of the next generation. And you want to make sure that your teachers are well qualified to do that. And I need to sort of preface this by saying, of course, there are tons of really brilliant teachers. There are also some great people in education faculties, and not all education faculties are the same. So forgive the generalization, but typically these programs are not producing the kind of training that we would expect given the importance of the job. And a lot of teachers will admit this themselves.
So one of the things that strikes me as so bizarre is you could have, Stephen Hawking, for example, when he was alive, one of the most brilliant physicists in the world, would be unqualified to teach a high school science class for lack of a Bachelor of Education. I mean, and that's the extreme example. You could have a former Prime Minister of Canada who decides in retirement he or she wants to teach a civics class at high school and wouldn't be able to. And there are little ways around that. Are there not?
Well, it's very limited, but yeah, that's you've hit on one of the absurdities of this B.Ed requirement, and we've encountered this with our charter schools, of which we now have 3. We're a specialized program, so we do things that are a little different than what a standard public school might do. We offer Latin and in high school, ancient Greek, for example. We focus very heavily on history, and it's almost impossible in our experience to find a certificated teacher, that is someone with a B.Ed, who can teach Latin, let alone ancient Greek. So there are a couple of provinces have devised some workarounds, some of them quite rarely used, whereby in Alberta, for example, the minister can offer an exemption for an individual to become a teacher. That's not really a scalable solution, though. So it's not just limited to us. I mean, there are STEM-focused charter schools. It's very hard to find people who can teach high-level science and technology or engineering courses, or there's arts academies similarly that encounter this problem. It's also experienced for vocational trades. If you've got someone who's like a master welder or something, or a woodworker, but they don't also have a Bachelor of Education, then it's very difficult to offer those courses in high schools.
Now, the argument, I suppose, if I give the government and the sort of the status quo the benefit of the doubt here, is that teaching is itself a skill that needs to be taught above and beyond the knowledge you have. And anyone who's taken, university classes can probably attest to this. There are brilliant people that are absolutely atrocious teachers. So why does the B.Ed not do that, in your view, or not do it well enough to justify its continued existence or requirement?
So yeah, very good point. I don't want to imply that just because you have a doctorate in literature that you are qualified to teach teenagers, right? A PhD doesn't qualify you to be a primary or secondary school teacher, but neither does a B.Ed. It takes a special kind of person who has the aptitude and the passion to do that. And teaching is, teaching in the sort of modern context is very much, it's an art and it's a craft. And what I would argue is that in addition to having sort of possessing subject matter content knowledge, which all teachers should have, the other dimension is learning the art and the craft of teaching. It takes a lot of special skills. There's a real art to classroom management, to assessments, to providing effective instruction, what we would call explicit instruction. And the best way to learn that is in the practicum. So we surveyed 26 of the teachers in our school system and asked them what they learned and what they didn't learn in their BEd. And the really devastating thing was a lot of them were saying that the practicum was really valuable, being in a classroom with an experienced mentor teacher guiding them. But very often the mentor teacher was telling them, ignore what you've learned in the classroom in your university. It's bunk. It's not going to work in practice. So I recall one teacher actually saying, the damage of my coursework, the damage of my BEd was mitigated by having great teachers in the practicum. But the actual coursework was according to our teachers, it was typically of little to negative value. It sometimes actively mal-educated them as to what effective teaching and effective pedagogy looked like.
Interesting. One point that I don't know if it's the same in other provinces, but in Ontario, they've, especially in the last several years, changed the length of time it takes to do a BEd, not based on the material you need, but based on, the availability of teaching jobs. At one point they made it 2 years because they had too many teachers and wanted to slow it down, and then they had too few, so they expedited it, which proves that in a lot of ways it is an arbitrary degree for some people.
Yeah, and to that point, there was during COVID era, there were some U.S. states that, on an emergency basis, hired teachers without certification. By the way, a number of U.S. states don't require it at all. But they found that in the aftermath of COVID, there was no real difference in the academic gains depending on whether students had a certificated teacher or one of these emergency hires without a teaching background or teacher training. So there was no real difference there. And again, I don't mean to discount the difficulty of teaching in a classroom. It is a really, really difficult job to do it well. But it doesn't seem to be correlated with whether you have a BEd or the length that BEd program took you to obtain.
What would your ideal model be? If you were the education minister in Alberta and you could just start from scratch, what would you make the requirement?
Well, I tend to err on the side of sort of local authority. So, the sort of the extreme recommendation would be to say, give superintendents, the people who are actually in charge of school authorities and who are closest to the level of practice and to being able to observe and assess teachers, give them the authority to decide who to hire. I know that this would not fly with the bureaucracy, and it would probably it would get some people's backs up. So I think another solution that we have proposed would be an alternative pathway to teacher certification, especially for people who already have a degree that is expedited over the 2 years. We've suggested a paid practicum-centered model. So maybe 1 year rather than 2 years, which is what it currently is for a post-degree BEd in Alberta. 1 year where you're sponsored by a school authority, you're being evaluated by them, they're paying you at least something, maybe not a full teacher salary, but something to minimize the opportunity costs that are associated with, for many people, a mid-career change in their profession. So make it practicum focused, have some coursework, but not nearly the degree of credits that are currently required because there's very little value, it seems, in that coursework, and really focusing on that practicum experience. And shortening the timeline. So one of the things we encountered was we have all these people that we've wanted to hire, but they have a doctorate in classics or philosophy or physics or something. They have families, they have mortgages. They can't drop out of the workforce for 2 years to go get a BEd. And so it's about figuring out how you can improve this sort of labor mobility and bring exceptional individuals who do have a passion and an aptitude for teaching into the profession.
And interestingly, I don't believe it exists in Canada, but in several United States, you can do that with law, where you can actually practice law without a law degree if you apprentice your way in by working under a lawyer. And again, something like that would sound so shocking to people, but this is not without precedent. And the law, I'd say, is, again, no offense to teachers, but a lot more of a complicated thing than teaching is.
Yeah, and like teaching, though, I mean, the idea that law is an academic discipline is sort of bizarre. I mean, there are sort of legal scholars, but legal practitioners are not academics. So focusing on coursework doesn't make sense, right? Actual like articling type experience is where the value is if you intend to be a legal practitioner. Of course, you also need to know things, right? So I would hope that people in these both of these professions would come at this with a lot of background knowledge that they can contribute. But yeah, it's not really an academic discipline. And faculties of education, again, I'll qualify this. There are some great people in these faculties, but in general, they're not known for their academic rigor. A lot of the teachers are disconnected both from classroom practice as well as from the serious research when it does occur. They're sort of political monocultures. They're heavily influenced by social reconstructivism and critical theory. So, I think I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but all the more reason to say this might not be the best approach to training teachers.
Well, if you want to learn a little bit more about this vision, Caylan Ford's piece in The Hub, Universities Have a Monopoly on Teacher Training. They Don't Deserve to Keep It, came out a couple of weeks back, but very timely now. Caylan, thanks for coming on today. And also, if you want your kids to get a classical education, the Alberta Classical Academy has you covered there. Caylan, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.